when I started preparing this talk, we realized that both Foster & Partners and Esri had been in business for almost 5 decades. And even though the two businesses do very different things, there's one question that brings us both together, and that really is the question of how can we live on this planet in a more sustainable way. Now, I'm not going to try and attempt to answer this question here and now. I'd rather like to illustrate it with 5 sort of key themes that run through the work that we've been doing in the last 5 decades before sort of looking at the work we've been doing more recently. And I would like to start by going back almost 50 years and start with one of the smallest buildings we've ever done. This is a small retreat outside a house in the countryside. And it's embedded in nature, and for me, it really sort of raises this question of how do we, as the people inhabiting this planet, relate to nature and inhabit nature. And I think it's also a stark reminder that at the end of the day, we're guests on this planet, and we need to think very carefully how, with our action, we start to alter the balances of the ecosystems, etc., around us. The second sort of important theme that runs through our work is about community, and these gentlemen who are enjoying their lunch break are actually sitting on top of the office building in Ipswich, completed in 1975. For us as designers, the way we organize spaces and functions in space really has a very strong relationship as to what it feels like to be there and how staff of an organization interact with each other, and particularly in buildings where we work with owner-occupier developers. We spend a lot of time to understand very carefully on how these operations work and how we need to design the spaces that fit these people. So you're seeing the rooftop garden. There's a swimming pool on the ground floor, and it was really about creating amenities and creating an atmosphere in the office that's engaging and gets people talking. It's also about technical innovation. And again, using the same building as an example, here we developed the first curtain wall facade in the UK back in 1975, working with Wilkington. And we also introduced a feature that today doesn't raise any eyebrows, which is the raised floor, as you see on the image on your right. As you can see also in the image, there's no PC, so this was a time where there's no need for network cable and power supply running to every desktop. But having a bit of foresight and understanding how technology will change made sure that when technology did arrive in the end of the day, the occupier of the building didn't have to spend a lot of money on ripping floors out and adjusting the building to these new circumstances. I'm going to take you to the Canary Islands, and this is an island called Gomera, which in the 1970s really struggled. The water supply was dwindling, the road network was inadequate, and there was just one hotel on the island. And our client asked us to think about what is a more sustainable way or a sustainable vision for tourism in that location. And the lesson for me from that project really is that we need to look backwards to look forwards. Technology often is a blessing, and it allows us things to do that we couldn't do without it, but also it means that sometimes our behavior becomes sort of skewed because of these opportunities. And what we've done here is look back at some of the original developments on the island and think about the building typologies and think about low-rise buildings that are really adapted to the climate and the local environment. The project also is a good reminder that whenever you are in urban planning or strategic planning, it's not going to happen within a day. A lot of these projects run for years or decades, and what this diagram here shows is just one vision of how we think the development could take place, and also sort of building flexibility into the project is really important, because the one thing we know that will happen is that everything's going to be different by the time you're about to go on site. These were just 3 projects, but there were 100 other ones that I'm not going to talk about. What we try to do with all these other projects is really to go back to my initial question, think very carefully about how all these projects can provide long-term value, how we can minimize the environmental impact on the planet, but also how we can build communities, because I think it's the people on these pictures, these are the ones that we really care about. We're based in London, as Helen introduced, and we're about 1,300 staff. And what's interesting about the office is that we really try and bring together the architects and the engineers and a lot of specialists in one big space to create, again, this level of exchange and communication throughout the studio. And there's a number of people with specialist skills, such as an acoustician, working with them. We have some non-human staff, like this robot arm that is being trained to lift boxes. Which in itself is not rocket science, but I think we understand that R&D is incredibly important, thinking about how construction technology will change. We're doing a lot of augmented reality, virtual reality, using games engines to do visualizations and so on. But despite all that technology and the thousands of images that we produce, we still build a lot of models, because at the end of the day, it's a very hands-on way of exploring a building, and it's still something that the clients like. And we got professional model builders and architects working together, developing these models. We're also using a lot of 3D printing these days, which allows us to build structures that hadn't been possible with traditional means. And these are some of my colleagues de-dusting some of these models as they come out of the machine. Within this organization, there's a small team that I'm heading up, which is the Urban Design Group. And we're sort of trying to follow the same principles of the office, where we're trying to complement the skills that exist elsewhere within the studio. So in my team, we have anything from landscape architects to urban economists, urban planners, and social anthropologists. And we're working together with the architects to think about the urban space in a more holistic and more intelligent way, hopefully. A lot of our work is about understanding cities. And we start off with these building footprint maps, or figure ground drawings as we know it. And the great thing about GIS technology is that it allows us to think very carefully about what's happening actually between these buildings and in these spaces. And using that technology, we can look at the land uses in Manhattan. We can think about building heights in Paris, or the building footprint coefficient in Beijing, or transport networks. And all these layers together make up the incredible things that are the cities around us. But despite all this technology, it's still incredibly important to go to these places and talk to people. And for us, it's sort of combined the quantitative, objective approach with the qualitative approach that really completes the full picture. If you want to create smarter cities, it's about having a smarter way and a smarter process of developing that. And I think that's what we're interested in. For us, smart cities are not necessarily about sensors and technology only. Yes, they're about creating a city which runs more smoothly or runs more efficiently, but they're also about cities that respond to the context. They're about cities that provide that encourage a more healthy lifestyle, and they're about cities that provide the citizens with information to make the right behavioral choices. What does that mean in practice? This is a project we've recently completed in Washington, D.C. We do a lot of mapping to understand the site context, looking at land uses, land values, and so on. We zoom into the site and look at the movement network. This is the old convention center site in Washington, D.C. And that building really sort of created an obstacle in the urban movement network. So what we've done is, in our scheme, is really to reconnect the city, which is not just beneficial for the site itself, but also it helps the surrounding areas, because cities are really complex organisms and they don't care much about site boundaries that a developer has drawn. So we always need to think about the relationship between the city and the wider context. And we also need to think about the land uses on the ground floor. And we heard it this morning. I think for us as designers, this is really where life is happening. And by connecting to surrounding streets, we can create more footfall, which in turn then enable all the cafes and the restaurants and bars that we all enjoy when we walk through cities. Now, a lot of things have changed in the last few years, and one of them is that technology has developed quite significantly, and the tools have become much more powerful. The other thing that's happened also is that there's an increasing amount of open data that we can use to analyze and do this work. So by putting these two things together, things really start to get more interesting. And a few years ago, we've been happy to have a simple sort of building footprint map, as you see on the screen now. Today, we can use LiDAR data to create a 3D point cloud to think about the heights and the building heights. And again, we heard about some of that already this morning. Using ArcMap, we can extract median building heights and then join that back to the building footprints and start to create 3D models. And then using the in-house printing facilities, we can effectively print pieces of cities. And these are really very simple but very clever and insightful ways of comparing cities and benchmarking cities. And we have some very good conversation with our client when we talk about the grain of these places and the grain of places that we design for them. But there's also a larger scale at which we're using GIS. I'm going to hand on to Theo now to talk about that.
Thank you, Bruno. So if we want to build smarter cities, we really need to start by understanding them better. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about London. We started looking at the road network in London, and we run a network analysis on this road network of streets, of avenues that connect the city together. What's really interesting is that the roads are really the bloodlines of the city. And we have the major arteries that connect to the beating heart, and then the smaller veins that come from it and constitute together this very complex network. And most, actually all, of the major arteries that were picked up by this network analysis are historic roads dating to Roman times. So it's a very old network indeed. In London, we also have one of the most comprehensive public transport system in the world, and one of the oldest. There's the tube network, the London Underground. We talked about it this morning a little bit, which covers most of the north of the city, and a comprehensive network of regional and local rail in the south. Altogether, there's also 19,000 bus stops that make up this public transport network. This is actively managed by Transport for London and by the mayor's office. And in turn, they create something that they call PTAL, or Public Transport Accessibility Levels. It's looking at each areas in the city in terms of its accessibility with public transport, of course. And we see here that the center of town is very accessible. That's where most of the lines converge. And there's also pockets of high accessibility near the main railway station. And that does not include Crossrail yet. And we need to create high density in London in near pockets of density. And actually, local authorities consider the accessibility levels before granting approval for high density development. This is a graph showing the population of London. After a century of growth, the population started decreasing just after the Second World War. And city officials at the time were planning for a city of roughly 6 million people. But then in the 1990s, growth picked up again quite steadily. And today, London has never been as populated as it is now, with 8.6 million people and 2.3 million expected to settle in the city in the next couple of decades. Londoners mostly live in the center of the city, but in some sort of donut of high-density living. This is showing residential density in the city. But during the course of the day, this changes. And as people go to work, the center of the city really peaks, the very center. That's where most of the jobs are located. And we can see here some other areas, usually near rail station, where densification happens. And we see an intensification in the use of the space. That's not surprising. It's because most of the jobs are, of course, located in the center of the city. But interestingly, if we look at that, if we zoom into the center of the city, we really see that different industries cluster in different parts of town. So we have the creative industries in Soho, performing arts around Covent Garden, or, of course, the financial services in the city of London, where about 400,000 people go to work every day. But in the 1990s, a secondary CBD started getting built in London, in Canary Wharf, further in the east. Today, it employs about 100,000 people. That's an interesting story. It's a fairly recent story in London. Canary Wharf didn't look like that just a few years back. That's a picture from the 1920s on the site of Canary Wharf. These were the Docklands, the main port of London. And we can see here a really strong trade center. We can see boats, barges, industry. It was really a powerhouse for London and for the UK, and really its main trading outpost. But in the second part of the 19th century, the port moved out, and it started a long period of decay and neglect in the area. By the 1920s, there were only empty warehouses and sheds sitting on the site of the port. This was re-tackled in 1981 with the setting up of the London Docklands Development Corporation. But really, it's investment in public transport and public infrastructure that really allowed the area of Canary Wharf to develop. And here we see the Canary Wharf tube station getting built. It's a station that Foster and Partners designed at the time. And by the 2000s, Canary Wharf had really become the secondary CBD of London. We see how the towers, here we see still the tube station in the middle by the dock, and we see how the towers have gathered around the station, really creating a cluster of high density. And this is how the station looks like today. The station was designed for ample spaces, a lot of natural light coming through, and is today one of London's busiest tube stations, with about 1 million people going through it every week. This, in turn, creates a lot of footfalls, which animates the space and allows the retail to flourish. Around the Canary Wharf station, the first buildings were commercial offices, here shown in grey. But more recently, perhaps, we had residential development, which really started to happen around this financial services district. And these are shown here in yellow. We're actually involved in one of those projects, designing London's tallest residential building in South Key Plaza. During the design of this tower, we used GIS to analyze the space. We actually looked at pedestrian accessibility that you see here on the left. We proposed at the time a footbridge connecting to the north of the dock. We also looked at views that you could get from different heights in this residential tower, and this in turn helped shape the design of the building. In Canary Wharf, we're also involved in designing the station of Crossrail, which is actually complete, the station is. And we've designed it again with shops and with connection to nearby building to create really a transit-oriented development around it to continue the long story of Canary Wharf. But we've also designed it with a public space on top, a garden under this respirable roof. And in a nice reminder of our design philosophy, here again, people come first, the garden is already open. So we've been involved in Canary Wharf as a practice for the past 30 years, and we're still involved there today. And we've learned a lot about how infrastructure can actually unlock the potential of a place. And we're taking this belief and those learnings everywhere we go. We looked at HighSpeed Rail in the UK, HighSpeed 2, and we looked at it as more than just a rail connector, but also as a potential spine of infrastructure that would carry network, that would carry utilities, perhaps high-speed internet, and that would be landscaped in the existing countryside, offering new possibilities for walking and cycling too. Looking at the future phases of HighSpeed 2, we're looking at how cities in the north are actually very well connected, and with HighSpeed 2, we'll create a true new urban region. 6 of Britain's 8 conurbations are located in short proximity, and there might be a potential for a 7th city to actually come and complete this hyper-connected urban region. And finally, we took this same thinking elsewhere in the world. We were asked a few years back to design a metro system for Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. And we actually looked at it not only from the eye of a designer designing station, but looking at it in terms of urban design. How could station actually transform the way the city worked? So we looked at each station, used GIS to do that, looked at the socioeconomics around each station to assess the potential of each station to create a new development. And GIS really helped us first in understanding how we can fit stations in a very busy urban environment, but also to understand the socioeconomic context around it. Because really what we wanted to do is that each station create a place, create a new sustainable neighborhood. So that's the street with the station. And that's the street with the future development that we foresee. And you see here retail, and you can see people animating the ground plane, because we believe that really smarter cities are not only about moving people around more efficiently, but it's about creating places where people want to stay. Thank you.
It's very good timing.
So this is an amazing story about smart cities being more than technology. And I think, you know, your firm is so much more than what people traditionally think of architects building buildings. You're building society, you're building space, you're building futures, as I talked about at the very start. But after visiting you and seeing some amazing work you're doing on things, one thing that struck me when I came back to the US and driving back from LAX is that this isn't happening in the United States. But you're working in Washington,
Yes.
making some changes in New York.
Yeah.
What do you think this thinking that you have will ultimately bring about in the next 5 to 10 years in the US?
Well, it's a very good question. I think the challenge of change and managing change is enormous, because so much money is invested in real estate and infrastructure, and it's obviously not very easy to just pull that all down and replace it. And I think the story of Jeddah is an interesting one, because there we can start from ground zero up and effectively create a new piece of infrastructure. I think for us it's really about trying to identify opportunities, and I think, you know, thinking about LA, there are public transport initiatives that are going in. There's talk about strategic rail infrastructure going through the whole length of California, etc. So I think there's some interesting actions and projects happening, and I think what we're trying to do is, you know, maybe help envision and create ideas of what these infrastructures and projects could do for the wider community.
Yeah, so bring your holistic view with all the different people that are part of your team to bring bigger thinking, more systemic design thinking to that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. It's a great presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.